Let's move on.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you, when was the last time you showered?
Oh,
this is a COVID times are weird times.
in the before time, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I figured. I would call you unpure. Then I'm afraid to say.
Well, in more ways, yes. It certainly outside. The outside should match the inside, I suppose.
Well, yeah, that seems like a thing.
Yeah.
But purity is not my particular point of expertise. I don't have one of those. So I think you've brought someone along to talk to us about the subject. That's better suited than either of us.
But let me introduce our guest this way, and that is to say that we have a huge range of listeners all across the religious spectrum, from old-time atheists to people that are still religious in some way, people that love the Jesus, but they've found maybe a less toxic place to commune with him rather than where they were raised, where they came from.
Can I just say that you used the phrase old-time atheist, and now all I can think of is like a honky-tonk piano in a bar with two guys going, well, I don't believe in God either, see?
I believe less than you, sir.
But I don't think that's what you mean. I think I understood what you meant. So keep going with what you're saying.
So we, in the years we've been on the air, we get requests for all kinds of topics because we cover all kinds of different stuff. What is the number one requested topic, Uncle Dan?
It's got to be sex, right?
Well, you've hit very close to the mark, and that is people want us to discuss purity culture. Ew. So we decided to get somebody who knows what the fuck they're talking about with that subject, who is Linda Kay Klein, who has written a book on the subject called Pure: Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. Linda, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
First question, what are you wearing? No, I'm sorry. That was wrong. I
feel like I can hear bare shoulders, and it's making me freak out. So yeah, you have a little personal experience from purity culture, don't you?
I do indeed. Yeah, I was raised in purity culture myself. In the heart of evangelicalism in the Midwest. There are so many hearts to evangelicalism. I could say the same thing for so many other places, but yeah. That question of what are you wearing is certainly one that I've been asked many times over the course of my life, and has been assessed, from I would say the age that I started to understand myself as somebody who was viewed by the outside world, not just somebody who was. Right? That transition from girldom to something else.
Can I just have you, Linda, maybe define what we're talking about when we say purity culture?
Yes. So, I would say that there are so many different aspects of this. Purity culture is the culture that's created when we look at the world as a binary that divides people into the two categories of pure and impure. And specifically, people are divided into pure and impure based on other people's perceptions of their sexuality, of their gender performance, these other things that are an assessment of others of your thought life, your feelings, right? Whether or not you're quote unquote inspiring sexual thoughts or feelings in someone else by, say, the answer to that question, what are you wearing? And also, of course, your activity, right? Your sexual activity. Now, pure and impure, these aren't, valueless concepts, right? This binary fits over a much larger binary, which is the binary of good and bad,
Right.
And if you're a religious person, and I would argue that though purity culture is often something that we talk about in Christian culture, certain Christian cultures, it's certainly something close to purity culture, or perhaps purity culture itself, depending on how you define it, is found in lots of different religious cultures and cultures in general. But
is that the purity police coming to get you?
Yeah,
right now,
I think you're in trouble. Run!
They found you. Cover up, woman.
This is life in New York City for you. So I apologize in advance. This might happen again. Every time you hear the siren, you'll know that we're touching on some dangerous ground.
Yeah,
That's right.
But anyway, if you're experiencing this purity message in a religious community, it usually also means saved or unsaved, right? One of us, or destined to burn in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
Now, there was a movement, if I may just go a little bit further, there was the purity movement, on the other hand, is a movement that was born out of the white evangelical Christian church in the late 80s, early 90s. And that spurred the purity industry, which is when we start to see just all these products, right? We start to see purity rings and purity pledges, which weren't in and of themselves, something that people purchased, but came with these big events, right? These concerts, these, places where you could buy T-shirts and you could buy coffee mugs and you could buy, almost anything, right?
Daddy-daughter dances, that sort of thing.
Sure. Purity-themed Bibles even, right? Where there's additional text added to the Bible all about the importance of your purity.
Within the books of the Bible, or is it an addendum?
An addendum is how I remember it. Yeah, there's two. So, yeah.
Wow.
So truly an industry. So all these things I kind of think of as a little bit distinct from one another. But, I think purity culture is a nice kind of catch-all term that says, so this is the culture that is created by all of this intentional effort.
Yeah. And again, that is something, I think that the purity industry is probably more a creature of the evangelical world. But again, the kind of shaming, especially of young girls and young women, is pretty prevalent in, I would say almost every strain of American Christianity on some level. Getting back to what I was saying earlier, you were everything was going relatively fine, right? You were a young evangelical, and I know you had some health problems when you were away at school that began to kind of change your view of things. And then you decided to go to college.
Yeah. So I, first applied to Bible college, as every good, evangelical does. And 2 weeks before I was supposed to go to Bible college, I changed my mind. And I sat my parents down and I said, I don't think that I want to become a missionary after all, which had actually been my intention.
Whoa.
To be a missionary who was also an actress, and who would therefore, perform with her very cute missionary husband, right?
Right. That was the goal, is you would kind of put on shows around the world, and
yeah. But 2 weeks before, I said to my parents, I don't think I want to be a missionary anymore. A lot had happened over the course of my years that made me start to feel like it, I was still an evangelical, but it wasn't something that I wanted to make my life a spokesperson for.
Right.
And so my parents, I feel very blessed, said to me, well, you don't have to transfer after the first year, as you just said, to a secular college. Why don't you just go to a secular college?
That is kind of lucky. That sounds like not every parent would say something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of my peers would not have had that conversation, In fact, many of my peers, the situation was their parents would pay for college only if they went to a Christian college, right?
Yep.
So my folks were great. They said, take a year off. I took a year off. I worked at Pier 1 Imports, right? I went to community college and I researched secular colleges for the first time in my life. And I ended up applying and going to Sarah Lawrence College.
Which is amazing. I love it.
Had never heard of Sarah Lawrence before. And if any of your listeners have also never heard of Sarah Lawrence, it is a liberal arts school, emphasis on the liberal. and just a very, very liberal place. One of the places that you go if you want to explore sexuality, if you want to transition genders, it's a real safe space for that kind of exploration. And I had absolutely
no idea. And it is probably one of the most entrenched feminist institutions in the country, I would imagine, right?
Absolutely.
So
you apparently got the trick brochure that doesn't tell you all the stuff.
Well, I mean, actually, the brochure that I remember, and a lot of my friends remember it too, and we talk about it all the time, said, "You are different," and then it said, "So are we." And I remember, growing up an evangelical, feeling like I never fit in. I was just never good enough for some reason, usually having to do with my body or, being perceived as flirting or whatever it was that I had done wrong that day. And then of course I get to Sarah Lawrence and I realized that being different wherever these people came from was very different than it was where I came from. and
you were the same kind of different.
Yeah, I became known on campus as like, so normal that it was a joke, right? Like one of my nicknames was the token straight girl.
Oh, yeah.
In my group of friends, I got called the Gap Girl because I shopped at the Gap, which was apparently very uncool, very mainstream and lame. So it was a massive transition, and I was suddenly exposed to an absolutely different worldview and very different approach to sexuality, to the body, to what it is to be a human being, and to try to negotiate, the world.
Can you talk a little bit about the special event that you participated in at Sarah Lawrence? I believe it was Sex Workers Week.
Well, I didn't participate in Sex Workers Week, but no, the week was called Sleaze Week.
Oh, Sleaze Week.
It was a week of school-sponsored events. I feel like poor Sarah Lawrence. Like, there must be like, why is she telling people that we paid for this for Sleaze Week? But it was school-sponsored events. It was a series of events where there was a sex worker, right? Who came in, and it was a celebration of sex work, was part of what Sleaze Week was about, but it was also where the sadomasochistic dance, took place, right? It was where the sex worker came in and gave a workshop where they taught people how to find their G-spot, complete with a invitation to come up and put on a rubber glove and find her G-spot, have her walk them through.
Wow.
Right? So yeah, it was definitely, and that's very early. That was very early in my time. In fact, that week, I remember my first year of college, they realized that Sleaze Week they had inadvertently planned it for the same week as Parents' Week.
Oh my God. That's amazing. Did your parents come?
No. We're from the Midwest. It was too long of a trip for them. But yeah, so I remember, it's pretty early on in campus life to be exposed to.
Your mind must have been blown right out of your ears.
Absolutely. A naked parade where people were walking around campus naked, celebrating their bodies.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
How did you respond to that? Were you terrified? Were you titillated? What was this sort of evangelical Midwestern girl's response to all of this, to this baptism by fire?
Well, what I participated in, if this is perhaps what you were referring to about my participation, I don't remember if it happened during Sleaze Week, but there was a sex education cabaret. And I was cast by somebody who was working on the cabaret as Martha Stewart. Because I was, the Gap girl, token straight girl. I was clearly the one to be cast as Martha Stewart. And I would, in this sketch, I would, and in fact, this was, by the way, years before Sarah Lawrence had this exact same character, or before Saturday Night Live had this exact same character. I would demonstrate during this cabaret as Martha Stewart how to use household items to, in sexual ways, right?
Oh, right. That's awesome.
Like saran wrap at the dental dam. So, so here I am sort of, engaging with this because I feel like in many ways it felt incredibly liberating, right? I was like, oh my gosh, you cannot have deep, overwhelming sexual shame and fear and anxiety.
You can actually laugh and have fun.
Yeah. But, the second part of the story, which is equally true, is that though on the surface I was able to, be in the safe sex cabaret, that's what it was called. It was called the Safe Sex Cabaret. Even though I was able to, on the surface, be part of something even like that, I was still utterly overwhelmed by my own deep sexual shame to the point where when I, over my time at Sarah Lawrence, eventually came to my long-term boyfriend and said, I've done a lot of thinking. I think that I want to have sex before marriage, and we started to engage in, what we thought was going to lead us to having sex. And I learned that, in fact, what it was going to lead us to was me utterly breaking down in tears, every time, breaking down in tears, holding myself in a ball, my eczema coming out, scratching myself until I bled, and taking a pregnancy test afterward, though we hadn't had sex. And that went
just
on.
Because it was so psychologically terrifying, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea of impurity, when you're utterly surrounded by the notion that if you are impure, that means you're on the bad side of the binary.
Right.
You're on the non-Christian side of the binary. You're on the like never going to be loved, side of the binary. Right. You're on the dirty side of the binary. You're on the broken side of the binary. You're on the worthless side of the binary,
Yeah.
And so though I felt like I was able to process, and had come to a different point of view about sexuality, and, had actually even determined that it did not feel like a sin to me to have sex outside of marriage, though I had been taught it was. I had so deeply internalized the overwhelming shame that came from the message that it was, a message I didn't even believe anymore. Right.
But that's the programming, isn't it? Like when you're taught these things at such a young age, they can just lie dormant, right? It's almost like landmines.
Yes. Just
getting laid that even when you're years out of it, and this is a lot of what our correspondents, asking about purity culture say. So they're like, look, I've been out of the religion for 25 years, but this still blows up in my face.
Absolutely.
And when you talk about being on the bad side, or the the devalued side of the binary, you have a story that you told that really relates to a story that we've talked about once or twice on the show before, which is the Elizabeth Smart kidnapping in, what was the early 2000s, Dan?
I wasn't actually involved, so I don't remember the exact dates.
Well, nothing has been proven.
Yeah, exactly.
But, that was a huge local story here, and her face was, on every mailbox and light pole, and there were hundreds of people scouring the hillsides and the mountains to look for her. And, she luckily survived her ordeal and has talked about later that, the first rape that occurred in her captivity was within the hour of her abduction. And she had hundreds of opportunities after that to pull the veil from her face. Everyone in the country knew what she looked like, right? It was such a celebrity kidnapping. But she didn't do it. And it was because she remembered that a teacher at a public high school that she went to here in Salt Lake City had told the girls in the class that nobody would want to chew a used piece of gum. And I just think that is so despicable to put into the minds of of young people. And you have a similar story, don't you?
Yeah. So I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about object lessons, and I want to talk about public schools. So first, object lessons. So there are countless object lessons. I've spent the last 15 years interviewing people who are raised in, a variety of communities, but predominantly evangelical Christian churches. And one of the things that comes up over and over and over again is an object lesson. Mm-hmm. So many different kinds, right? The one that I explain in detail in the book is the Oreo, right? Mm-hmm. One of my interviewees tells a story about her teacher, again, a public school, raising an Oreo up in front of the room and saying, "Who wants this Oreo?" And everybody raises their hand, right? Everyone wants the cookie. And then she passes the Oreo around the room and she has each person spit on it or drop it on the ground. And when it gets back to her, she holds it up again and she says, "Now, who wants this Oreo?" Nobody raises their hand. And it's presented as an illustration of how disgusting and unwanted you are after having any sexual encounters. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is something that, Elizabeth Smart talks about the gum object lesson. There is a used car and a new car, a used bike and a new bike, a used Kleenex and a new Kleenex, a hamburger that has been devoured and a hamburger that, no one's touched yet, a sucker that's been devoured and a sucker that no one's touched yet, which feels like a real, it's double entendre. But, there's just a lot of ways that this metaphor that you are worthless and will never be loved,
and disgusting
and
too.
disgusting. Yeah. And what's interesting about public schools is that though this message, I associate as being a big part of the purity movement, this points to the fact that, well, two things. One, the purity movement was only successful because there was already a strong foundation of deep sexual shame, well laid in our culture, and I would argue most cultures. And so the purity movement, didn't present any new ideas, right? The idea that a woman would become disgusting and not take home to mom material the moment that you did anything sexual with her, that's not a new notion, right?
Right.
So first of all, the foundation. And then second of all, the movement, the purity movement, made a really intentional effort to spread this messaging well beyond the 25% of the country that is evangelical. And certainly the Mormon population has a very significant purity culture. But beyond these religious cultures. And one of the places that they put a lot of focus on was public schools.
Yeah.
And because so much funding for sexuality education in public schools is you'll only get federal money if you teach abstinence only, emphasis on only, before marriage, right? So you can't teach anything else. A lot of, I don't know if you've ever, hung out with a lot of sex educators, but sex educators don't tend to teach that curriculum.
No, right.
So
because that's not sex education,
right? So the curriculum that's out there that teaches that is the curriculum of the purity movement, is a curriculum that does not teach you anything about sex or sexuality, but teaches you shame.
Yeah,
right.
And that was a huge push. As I recall, that was one of the big fights during the W. Bush administration, was pushing abstinence-only education into the public schools and trying to strip funding from any school that didn't do that. So I think it's been enormously effective, sadly.
Yeah, and still, still to this day.
And if I'm understanding you correctly, you're if I may try to encapsulate your position, you're against this. Is that
Yeah.
You're taking the non-pro position on this. Tell us why is it bad to be an abstinence only, to take that position, and what should be in its place?
Right. Well, I mean, it's actually really interesting because I think one of the things that adults really are quite afraid of when it comes to young people and young adults is choice and information. I think that adults feel like, oh my gosh, we just have to keep them in the dark.
Right.
They can't know that this stuff exists, because if they know it exists,
then they'll do it.
Then they'll surely do it, right? Then
Yeah.
they'll be in horrible danger. So we can't give them any information about it,
of
you
course.
know? And we just need to make it clear that you only need to know one thing, and that's don't, right?
Right.
Because if you know any more, maybe you'll choose. And oh my God, you'll probably almost definitely choose wrong.
Yeah.
So no information, no choices. And actually, what's really interesting is that the research shows that that abstinence only before marriage messaging, does not delay the first age of intercourse, and it does not decrease the number of sexual partners that someone actually has. So it's highly ineffective at doing what it proposes to do. However, actually giving people information, and giving them choices, and giving them, I think, something that's really, really absent, even in some of the good sexuality education models that are out there, not entirely to their, being their fault, because it's just not accepted, is not only giving them choices, but teaching them how to choose, right?
Right.
Like, how do you make a healthy choice? Here's all the information. Right?
Yeah.
Now, how do you make a healthy choice that is going to lead you to a respectful engagement with other people? Pacing yourself at the rate that is right, for you.
Right.
These types of things are things that ultimately end up getting robbed of people if they oftentimes have only ever learned the purity message, because as soon as the purity message is exposed as unhelpful at best, they have no other tools or resources.
Right. They're flying completely blind.
Totally.
And in, I would guess, a majority, I don't know how big a majority of cases, kids are doing it anyway. Right. And they're fumbling and they're flying blind and they're possibly putting themselves in different sorts of danger.
Yeah.
So, generation
no
of
one to talk to about it.
Yeah, and they have no one exactly. They can't go to their parents about it. They can't go to their, their community leaders, which in a lot of cases would be church leaders, about it.
Well, and their school counselors are proving just as worthless. It's like there's no adult in the adult room.
Yeah.
We've failed as a society on this whole front. It's just insane.
I actually do a lot of coaching for people who are recovering from purity culture, and I have this conversation with people sometimes, where they talk about, gosh, when I needed to learn, I went to these places, that I felt like I wasn't, supposed to go, right? The internet, in short,
Right.
Yeah.
And then felt so much shame and so much self-hatred. And we have to look back and say, okay, what other resources did that kid have, right?
Yeah.
Could they have gone to their parents? Could they have gone to their church? Like where could they have had the healthy discussions that they needed to have,
Well, and the problem is that, like, anyone who goes against their parents and says, hey, I'll talk to you about this, runs the risk of being imprisoned. You know what I mean? You can't go and talk to a teenager that you don't have a relationship with about sexuality.
That's true. Yeah. It is very complicated. It is very complicated.
So talk to us a little bit, excuse me. So talk to us a little bit about, you mentioned you being helpful in counseling people and helping people who have been traumatized by this, by this purity culture.
Shame-based culture, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about what recovery looks like and how long, what might be necessary for that to happen.
Yeah. Recovery, ranges dramatically in terms of how long it takes. Unfortunately, the first step, I'm sure that your audience has heard the term deconstruction, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first step is the taking apart, saying, here are all the things that I was taught. Okay, let me pull it all apart,
Right.
let me lay all the parts down on the ground and look at them all,
Mm-hmm.
And then, after a period of time, you're able to say, okay, this actually maybe was useful for me, right? And this was remarkably harmful, and so you start to reconstruct afterward. But the deconstruction process is a destabilizing process, right?
Yeah, it can be very painful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how long that takes and how quickly you're able to deconstruct and then get into the next stage of reconstruct, varies dramatically, based on whether you have support, whether you have people to talk to, how deep the shame goes, but also, it's something that sometimes people will get into the deconstruction process and it'll be too hard and they'll end up going and they just say, never mind, never mind, never mind, never mind. Right.
Right.
Because all of a sudden you have nothing, right?
Yeah.
Eventually you'll reconstruct and you'll have some new foundation, some new understanding of the world. Right. But in the meantime, you don't know what's up. You don't know what's down. You don't know what's right. You don't know what's wrong. You don't know who you can trust. You don't know if you can trust yourself. You had a worldview that you were certain of at one point, and now you're not certain of it at all anymore. So can you trust anyone? Someone taught you that. Can you trust yourself? You believed that.
Well, especially because a lot of that, that cultural programming came from people you trusted implicitly, right? It's parents and clergy and, aunts and uncles. And so if you suddenly find that you can't trust what the most important people in your life, taught you was a value, who else can you trust? That's pretty devastating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And keep in mind that, in these cultures, you're often being taught that the heart is deceitful and you are good only by grace, right?
Right.
You are inherently terrible, and hellbound.
You're far too broken to make these decisions.
Yeah, you're born broken, and you have to find a way to get well.
Yeah. So how do you then say, I'm gonna trust myself?
Right.
I'm gonna believe my own experience. I'm gonna believe
it's a gaslighting.
Yeah.
Everybody's been gaslit into not trusting their own eyes, ears, and heart on these things.
Yes.
Yeah. It's well, I think that's a very hopeful note to end on, Dan. But I do have one last question, Linda, and that is, do you have a picture of what Gap outfit you selected to wear to the S&M ball? I'm just wondering what's available. That's probably not in Gap Kids. It's probably is there like Gap After Dark?
Yeah, it's great. It's funny. I did a commercial in my hometown years ago, and I don't think you can find it online anywhere. I've tried, but I was wearing it wouldn't. Good luck, but I was wearing a full length down to the floor Gap jean dress,
nice.
and a striped Gap sweater cardigan over it.
Woo.
So it's
you
hilarious.
Would have fit right in my high school.
Yeah, so I
totally.
I really looked. I mean, it's funny because the commercial. I think I was 18, right?
Yeah.
And they paired me with a quote unquote husband for the commercial who was in his late 30s. And
fit right in Utah.
Kind of looked right. Yeah, I kind of was dressed like I was in my late 30s. But if you don't mind, I would love to just share a little bit more because I know that we're ending on potentially a dark note. And I know so many people are really hungry to heal. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about my healing journey, if you don't mind. Do we have the time?
Of course, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So for me, there were many years in which I was trying to go it alone and just figure this out on my own, or figure this out with my new secular friends who had absolutely and utterly no idea what I was talking about.
Right.
And it wasn't until, I started to call up my girlfriends from back home in the evangelical church that I was still in touch with, even after ultimately leaving myself, and telling them about this debilitating shame that I was experiencing, that I started to realize I wasn't alone, because when I exposed myself, they, for the first time in their lives, told their stories, which were reflections of my own.
And they hadn't told anybody before, right? Because they just,
right.
Yeah.
We all thought we were the only ones. And that was 15 years ago, right?
Wow.
Purity culture wasn't a term. There were no blogs. There were no books. There were no, we didn't even know that there had been a purity movement, let alone that we were one of the first groups of adolescents to have grown up in it,
Right.
And so, after a few years of these kind of whispered conversations with some of my friends, and then starting to venture out and talk to people who I met other places who were raised in evangelical churches, I started to realize, okay, wait, this is actually I think a more common experience than I had anticipated. And so I moved back to my hometown. I did a year of formal interviews with every young woman from my church youth group who I could get a hold of that year, about their adult experiences with sex and gender and how the messaging we were raised with had impacted them. And then that led to interviews with people around the country on this topic. And that process actually is what I think was the most healing for me. It was the process of understanding my story within a larger context. There were others who were experiencing this. We were experiencing this for a reason, and the more that I could understand our story, the more that my story made sense. And, sometimes, how it is, it's so much easier when you hear someone else talk about something and you go, well, of course that's not shameful, right?
Yeah.
But, if it's you, you're like, I'm a wretch,
Yeah.
So there's something also about just hearing your story in the mouth of someone else and having an empathy for them and realizing that's me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why we encourage people to tell their stories, and people come on here and tell their stories, because I think there's more commonality than there is difference in a lot of them.
Yeah. And the differences are even instructive, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So that's I just wanted to end on a hopeful note. And
well, that's not
Yes.
really our brand, so we're going to cut
I feel like you
part
ruined
out.
it. We were bumming everybody out real good, and then you came along and fixed it for us.
Some expert. So,
Yeah.
Well, listen, Linda, if the people want to find out more about you, if they want to find your book, whatever, where can they find you out there in the world?
Yeah. Well, I have a nonprofit called Break Free Together, and we actually host story exchanges of different kinds for people to do exactly this kind of healing work.
Oh, excellent.
So people can find that at breakfreetogether.org. And I also have a personal website. So my personal website is Linda Kay Klein, and that's my middle name spelled out, KAY.com. And there you can read about the book. You can read about the one-on-one coaching for folks who are healing from this, and other things there.
Excellent. Well, we'll include that in the show notes, and find that picture for me. I'm really interested in the Gap S&M gear. So, well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.